Ideas of racial inferiority were ideas that most white Americans had, whether those white Americans were in the North or whether they were in the South. The difference was that in the South, those ideas were used to support an institution of human bondage. In the North, those ideas supported racial segregation, racial discrimination.
They changed in a day the face of war, the face of the war between the states, and the face of social expectations in the United States.
The 54th Massachusetts Regiment broke a social and cultural barrier in history. African Americans were not allowed to join the United States Army due to their status in society. On July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Militia Act, which allowed African Americans to fight for their freedom. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was a part of the Union Army and contributed to the end of the Civil War. This regiment was a volunteer infantry regiment that was made up of African Americans. It later became famous for its great courage of its members. Not only was this regiment fully made up of African Americans, but it was the first African American fighting regiment. The story and journey of the 54th Regiment gained further attention through the film Glory in 1989. This American war film, directed by Edward Zwick, won several Academy Awards and Golden Globe Awards due to them showing the selfless and heroic actions of the 54th Regiment in the American Civil War and the Battle of Fort Wagner. Due to Glory having such a large audience, this African American fighting regiment gained lots of recognition over the years. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. Although the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves, it only proclaimed the freedom of slaves in the 10 Confederate states still in rebellion, which means that the African Americans under Union control were still enslaved. The barrier in history was racism and discrimination towards blacks. The cause of this barrier was segregation between the whites and the African Americans. This led to blacks being treated very poorly, such as having to use different water fountains, sit on different sides of the bus, and go to different schools. During this time, African Americans were not treated rightfully and did not receive the equality they deserved. At this time, African Americans were slaves and former slaves, and people such as the federal government and the Union Army did not care for them and thought they did not have much worth, so they did not want them to have the ability to be able to enlist in the Army. Massachusetts was one of the original 13 colonies of one of the 6 New England states and is well known for being the landing place of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. English explorer and colonist John Smith named the state for the Massachusetts tribe. Enslaved people and free African Americans held the least amount of power, but at the top were the white wealthy landowners with the most amount of power. Due to African Americans having such a low ranking in the social status, this is another reason why the racism and discrimination barrier was created. African Americans weren't allowed to enlist in the Army and were treated and judged based on their color, unlike the white males. The issue that arose from this was the start of the Civil War. An economic problem that contributed to this issue was that the African Americans that were enslaved in the U.S. were valuable property and contributed to the economics of the cultural South and the manufacturing North. The people who initiated the barrier were the federal government and the Union Army, who wanted to prevent blacks from being able to enlist. This barrier first took place in the mid to late 1800s in Boston, Massachusetts. It was created due to the racism towards blacks, which resulted in African Americans protesting against the unfair barrier.
3 key actions that immediately occurred to break the barrier were known as social, cultural, and environmental actions. The people in the North socially worked together to break the discrimination against African Americans and for them to fight in wars. Northern culture was different because of the beliefs they had from the South, and they wanted to create equal rights for African Americans, which includes them being eligible to enlist in the Army. The surrounding people in the Northern environment took a stand for the blacks to give them a chance to fight for their own and others' freedom. These 3 key actions were taken by the North. The people in the North that worked together to break the discrimination against the African Americans. The people in the North, which had different beliefs than those in the South and wanted to create equal rights for African Americans, and the surrounding people in the North that took a stand for the African Americans to give them a chance to fight for their own freedom. The significant changes that occurred were that blacks were allowed to fight in the Civil War and are now eligible to enlist and fight in current and future wars. African Americans were able to enlist in the Army, had a say in the world, and were given racial equality, which are all positive effects. The world is different today due to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment because African Americans are treated more equally. African Americans are shown more respect and have equality just like everyone else, and they're not viewed differently as they were back then due to the decision to break the barrier.
The next slide is a clip from the film Glory of a soldier from the 54th Regiment doing a selfless act.
If this man should fall, who will lift the flag and carry on?
I will.
Next are two clips referring to the fact that African Americans aren't slaves, but are now just regular American citizens. One of these clips being a segment from Glory.
Y'all's the only family I got.
Well, that's our family. That's all right.
And, I love the 54.
All right.
Ain't much a matter what happens tomorrow. But we men, ain't we?
Yes, sir. Amen.
Amen. Douglas was once asked, would the slave fight? He responded that no, the slave would not fight. But he said if you asked him, would the black man fight? The answer was yes.